The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were the days I allowed myself a real cup of coffee instead of the gas station stuff. I had just gotten back from the dollar store with a can of soup and a pack of crackers that were on clearance, and there it was, sitting in the mailbox like it had been waiting for me all morning. A white envelope with the name of a collections agency printed in the upper left corner. I already knew what was inside before I opened it. I'd been getting variations of the same letter for 3 months. But this one was different. This one had a deadline, 14 days to vacate the property or face formal legal proceedings. 14 days. I stood in the driveway of the small rental house in Greensboro, North Carolina, holding that envelope, and I thought about how strange it was that the sky could be that particular shade of blue on a day like this. Bright and clear, the kind of October sky that makes people want to take pictures. And there I was, 29 years old, holding a piece of paper that told me I was about to lose the only place I'd lived for the past 2 years. My name is Joel Mercer, and I want to tell you something about the 18 months that led to that moment, because it matters. It matters because if you've ever had your life come apart at the seams through no single catastrophic event, but just the slow, steady erosion of bad luck stacked on bad luck, then you already understand something that's hard to explain to people who haven't been there. I had been working as a field technician for a mid-sized HVAC company out of Winston-Salem. Good pay, solid hours, benefits that covered my basic health insurance. I was never going to get rich doing it, but I was stable. A savings account with a little over $4,000 in it, which felt like a cushion. I had a car that ran. I had a one-bedroom rental house that I kept clean and paid on time every month. I was building something slow and steady the way you're supposed to. Then in the span of about 7 weeks, 3 things happened. First, I slipped on a wet floor at a job site and tore a ligament in my left knee. My employer's workers' comp policy was supposed to cover it, but there was a dispute about whether the floor had been properly marked, and the whole thing got tangled up in paperwork. I was off work for 6 weeks, pulling reduced comp pay that barely covered my car insurance and utilities. The $4,000 cushion started to shrink. Second, while I was still on crutches, my car needed a transmission repair. $840. That was non-negotiable because without the car, I couldn't get back to work once my knee healed. Third, and this is the one that still makes me feel a little hollow. When I think about it, the HVAC company was bought out by a larger regional chain while I was on leave. The new ownership did an immediate restructuring, which is a professional way of saying they eliminated 1/3 of the existing workforce. I got the call on a Wednesday afternoon. The woman on the phone was perfectly pleasant about it, which somehow made it worse. She told me my position had been eliminated effective immediately, but that I would receive 2 weeks of severance pay. 2 weeks. By the time I could walk again and start applying for new jobs, I had less than $800 left in savings, and 2 months of unpaid rent accumulating behind me. I applied everywhere. I put in applications for HVAC positions, construction, warehouse work, delivery driving, anything that matched what I could physically do while my knee was still recovering. I had a decent resume. I had real skills. But every promising lead either went quiet after the first interview or came back with a timeline of 4 to 6 weeks for onboarding. 4 to 6 weeks was time I didn't have. The hardest part of those months, the part that doesn't come across when you're telling someone your situation in brief, was the silence. Not literal silence, but the silence of a phone that doesn't ring with good news. The silence of an inbox full of nothing but bills and automated rejection messages. I would wake up at 5 in the morning with a kind of low-level panic that settled in my chest before I even fully opened my eyes. I'd lie there in the dark cataloging what I owed, running numbers I already knew by heart, hoping the math would somehow come out different than it had the night before. It never did. There were mornings I drove to the library to use their Wi-Fi so I could save my mobile data. I sat at one of those long tables with my laptop, surrounded by retired men reading newspapers and kids doing homework, and I filled out applications. I tried to look like a person who had somewhere to be afterward. I tried very hard not to think about what I was going home to. If you believe there are still people in this world who choose to see the best in strangers, people who act on that belief even when they have no obligation to, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories exist because kindness exists, and we need to keep finding them. My landlord, Beverly Crane, was a 67-year-old retired school administrator who owned 3 rental properties in Greensboro. She had bought them over the years as retirement investments, and she managed them herself with a system of color-coded folders and a spiral notebook she kept in her car. She was not, by any conventional measure, a pushover. She had been in the rental business long enough to know that people with hard luck stories were not always telling the truth, and she operated accordingly. She sent notices on time, kept meticulous records, and did not bend on deadlines. I had rented from her for 2 years without a single problem. I paid on the first, sometimes before the first. I had her cell number from when a pipe had frozen the previous winter, and we had exchanged maybe 6 text messages in the entire span of our relationship. She was professional and fair, and I respected that. After I got behind on rent, I had slipped an envelope under the door of her home office, with a handwritten note explaining what had happened. I told her about the injury, the job loss, the restructuring. I told her I was doing everything I could to get back on track and asked if we could discuss a payment plan. She had called me 2 days later and offered me a 60-day extension with the understanding that I would pay the full arrears, plus the following month when I got back on my feet. I had agreed gratefully. The 60 days came and went. I still didn't have a job. I asked for more time. She gave me another 30 days, then another 2 weeks. And then the collections agency letter arrived. I didn't blame her. That's something I want to be honest about. She had been more patient with me than many landlords would have been. And she was running a business, not a charity. But standing in that driveway with the October sky being unreasonably beautiful overhead, I felt something give way inside me. Not dramatically. Not like a collapse. More like something that had been holding on with everything it had just quietly let go. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without doing much of anything. I had a job application open on my laptop that I'd been filling out for a logistics company in Durham. Good position. Reasonable commute. I'd been working on my cover letter for an hour and had written exactly 2 sentences. I stared at those 2 sentences for a while, then closed the laptop. I started making a mental list of where I could go. My mother lived in Raleigh, but she was in a 1-bedroom apartment and had her own financial situation to manage. My college roommate was in Phoenix. I had a cousin in Virginia Beach who had once said I could crash there if I ever needed to. But that was the kind of thing people say and don't necessarily mean. I was trying to figure out which of these options was the least terrible when my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Beverly. She said she'd seen my car in the driveway and asked if I was home. She said she'd like to come by and talk if that was okay. I almost didn't respond. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from preparing yourself over and over to receive bad news, and I was well into that territory. I assumed she was coming to confirm the timeline, to walk through what the next steps would be. I typed back that she could come by whenever she wanted. She knocked on my door 20 minutes later. She was wearing a green quilted vest over a flannel shirt, and she had her spiral notebook tucked under her arm. I stepped back to let her in, and she came inside and looked around the way she always did, not inspecting exactly, but taking stock. She looked at the moving box I had pulled out of the closet and left by the wall. I hadn't packed anything yet, but the box was there, and it was obvious why. She sat down at my kitchen table without being asked. I sat down across from her. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she set her notebook on the table and folded her hands over it and looked at me directly. The way people do when they're about to say something they've already decided. She told me she had read my application file again that morning. She said she'd been in this business for 14 years, and that she'd dealt with a lot of tenants in a lot of situations, and that she had a pretty reliable sense, at this point, of the difference between someone running from their responsibilities and someone who'd been knocked sideways by circumstances. She said she believed I was the second kind. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She told me she wasn't there to push the eviction forward. She told me she was there because she had an idea, and she wanted to know if I was open to hearing it. I told her I was. What Beverly Crane said next rearranged something fundamental in how I understood the situation I was in. She didn't offer me more time. She didn't offer to waive the back rent, not directly, not then. What she told me was that she had a problem of her own, and she thought I might be the right person to help her solve it. She had purchased a 4th property, a duplex on the east side of Greensboro, not far from where I lived. She'd gotten it at a good price because it needed significant work, and she had planned to renovate it herself with a rotating crew of contractors over the following year. But she'd recently been diagnosed with a condition affecting her vision, Nothing immediately dangerous, but serious enough that her doctor had told her to reduce her time driving and to stop taking on physical project work for the foreseeable future. She could no longer manage the renovation the way she'd planned. What she needed was someone she could trust to be on site regularly. Someone to coordinate with the contractors, manage materials deliveries, check the work, catch problems early, deal with the day-to-day logistics of a renovation project. She didn't need a licensed contractor. She already had those. She needed a reliable, detail-oriented person who would show up every day and make sure things actually happened the way they were supposed to. She looked at me and said she thought that person could be me. The compensation she was offering was not a salary. It was something else. If I took on the coordination role for the renovation, she would suspend the eviction proceedings immediately. She would zero out 4 months of the back rent I owed as payment for my time on the project, and she would give me 3 months of reduced rent going forward, at a rate low enough that even part-time work could cover it, while I continued looking for a full-time position. She was not handing me a lifeline made of charity. She was offering me a trade. Her problem for my problem. She needed someone she could trust. She had decided based on 2 years of careful observation that she could trust me. I remember sitting there and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific sensation of being seen as a capable person rather than a problem to be managed. I also felt something close to disbelief. I told her honestly that I hadn't done renovation coordination before. I told her I knew HVAC systems and I knew job sites in a general sense, but I wasn't a project manager. She said she didn't need a project manager. She needed someone who would show up, pay attention, ask questions, and tell her the truth about what was happening. She said, and I've thought about this many times since, that the skills required to be reliable are not industry-specific, they're character-specific. I told her I would do it. The next morning I drove to the duplex on Elmwood Avenue for the first time. It was a squat 2-story brick building that had probably been built in the late 1960s. The yard was overgrown. There were water stains on the exterior walls beneath several windows. The gutters along the back were detached and hanging at an angle. Inside, the floors were scarred hardwood under layers of old carpet and vinyl. The kitchen on the lower unit had cabinets that had been painted so many times the doors no longer closed properly. The bathroom tile was original and cracked in several places. It was a substantial project, but I walked through it that first morning with a contractor Beverly had already hired. A quiet man named Steve who had been doing residential renovation in Greensboro for 25 years, and I started asking questions. What goes first? What's load-bearing? What needs permits and what doesn't? Where are the hidden costs usually going to come from in a place like this? Steve seemed mildly surprised that I was asking the right questions. He answered all of them. I went home that night and made a spreadsheet. I mapped out every trade we'd need, the sequence they'd need to work in, the rough timeline Steve had estimated, and a list of questions I still had. I texted it to Beverly. She called me 10 minutes later and told me that was more than she'd expected on day one. Something shifted in me that week. I had been living in a kind of suspended state for months, where every day felt like waiting for something to either get better or get worse. And then suddenly I was in motion, not just going through the motions of applications and interviews, but actually doing something that required my attention, my judgment, my presence. I woke up in the mornings with things to figure out instead of just things to dread. The work was not glamorous. I was on site by 7:30 most days. I fielded calls from the plumber about a corroded supply line they hadn't anticipated. I drove across town to compare prices on reclaimed hardwood from 2 different salvage yards, because Beverly wanted to preserve the character of the original floors where possible. I kept a running log of every expense and every conversation with every contractor, because I'd learned from watching good tradespeople that the only way to catch a problem early is to document everything before you need to explain it to someone else. There were frustrating days. A week in November when the electrician was supposed to rough in the upper unit but didn't show up for 3 consecutive days. A dispute between Steve and the tile guy about whose job it was to prep the bathroom subfloor. A delivery of windows that came in the wrong size and had to be returned and reordered, pushing us back by almost 2 weeks. I handled each of these things the best I could, escalating to Beverly when I needed to, absorbing the rest. Somewhere in there, something else started to happen too. One of the neighbors, an older man named Arthur who lived in the house directly next to the duplex, had started appearing at the fence line around mid-morning most days, watching the work with obvious interest. After a few weeks of polite nods, he started talking to me while I was on break. He was 81 years old, recently widowed, and had lived in that house for 43 years. He told me about the neighborhood, who had lived where, what it had looked like in different decades. He told me about his wife, Patricia, who had planted the rosebush along the side of the fence and made him promise never to cut it down. We started having coffee together occasionally, me with a thermos from home, him with an actual ceramic mug he brought from his kitchen. He was sharp and funny and unexpectedly knowledgeable about construction, because he'd spent 30 years working for a commercial builder before he retired. Some mornings he'd spot something from his side of the fence that I'd missed. A soffit that was pulling away from the fascia. A place where the grading near the foundation was sloping the wrong direction, and he'd mention it in that gentle way that made it feel like he was just thinking out loud rather than correcting me. Which he was doing both, really. I started stopping by his house on weekends, not just to talk, but because I'd noticed some things around his property that needed attention. A section of the handrail on his front steps that had worked loose. A downspout that had disconnected and was directing water toward the foundation. Small things, but the kinds of small things that become larger things if you leave them alone. I fixed them without making a production of it. He noticed. He didn't say much about it, but he started telling other people. I didn't know that at the time. I only found out later. Before we get to what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this right now, will you take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from? And tell me one small act of kindness you've witnessed recently. One thing that reminded you that people are still capable of looking out for each other. I read every comment, and I promise you, those stories matter more than you know. In late January, Beverly stopped by the duplex to walk through the progress. We were about 4 months into the project, and the lower unit was close to finished. New floors, new kitchen, freshly painted throughout. The upper unit still had a few weeks of work left, but the bones were done. She stood in the kitchen of the lower unit for a while without saying anything, just looking around, running her hand along the edge of the new countertop. She told me I'd done a good job, not in an effusive way, just directly, like she was reporting an observable fact. We talked for a while about the remaining timeline. And then she told me something she hadn't mentioned before. She said she'd been approached by a property management company that was interested in taking over her rental portfolio. She was getting to the age where the day-to-day of managing properties was becoming more than she wanted to handle, especially with her health situation. She hadn't made any decisions yet, but she was thinking about it seriously. And then she said something that caught me off guard. She asked me if I had ever considered property management as a field. I told her honestly that I hadn't, not seriously. I knew what it was, but I'd never thought of it as a career path. She told me she'd spoken with a man named Conrad Phelpsott, who ran a regional property management company based in Greensboro. She said she'd been describing the renovation project to him, and in the course of that conversation, had mentioned me and the work I'd been doing. He had apparently expressed interest in meeting with me. A week later, I drove to an office on Battleground Avenue and sat across from Conrad Phelps for 45 minutes. He was a methodical man who asked very specific questions and waited for complete answers before responding. He asked about my background in HVAC, about my experience coordinating the renovation, about how I'd handled the difficult weeks with the contractors. At one point, he pulled up the spreadsheet I'd sent Beverly on day one and said she'd forwarded it to him as part of what she'd described. He asked me if I could show him how I organized my documentation. I walked him through it. He asked a few more questions. Then he told me that his company managed 47 rental properties in the Greensboro and Burlington area and that they were actively looking to expand. He said the skills for doing that kind of work well were not common, that a lot of people could learn the technical side, but that the reliable judgment piece was much harder to find. He offered me a full-time position as a property coordinator with a starting salary that was 20% higher than what I'd been making at the HVAC company, full benefits, and a clear path towards senior coordinator within 18 months if things went the way he expected. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my driveway for a long time, not because I was uncertain, because I needed a moment to understand what had just happened. 14 days had turned into something else entirely. I accepted the position and started the following Monday. The work suited something in me that I hadn't known needed suiting. I was good with logistics, good at paying attention, good at managing relationships with contractors and vendors and tenants simultaneously. The job required the same things that working the renovation had required, just at greater scale and with better pay. Within 6 months, I had cleared the remainder of the back rent, rebuilt a savings account, and started sleeping through the night again, which sounds minor until you've spent 8 months waking up at 4 in the morning to do math that never comes out right. The duplex on Elmwood Avenue was finished in February. Beverly leased both units within 3 weeks of completion. I wasn't working for her anymore by then. I was at Conrad's company, but she called me the day she got the signed leases and told me. She sounded genuinely pleased, and I understood why. It had been a project she'd invested in more than one sense. Arthur still lives next door to it. I stop by to see him every couple of weeks. He makes coffee in actual ceramic mugs and tells me things about the neighborhood that I don't need to know, but find that I genuinely want to know. Last spring, he let me divide and transplant part of Patricia's rosebush to a spot along his back fence where it gets better light, and he stood and watched with his arms crossed and said she would have approved of that, which I took as a significant compliment. I think about the sequence of events sometimes, the way you do when something in your life has turned and you can trace the exact axis of the turn. Beverly Crane didn't save me by giving me something. She saved me by needing something that I happened to be capable of providing. Conrad Phelps didn't give me a break out of generosity. He made a rational business decision based on evidence he'd been given. Arthur didn't change my life by any single act. He just talked to me over a fence during coffee breaks and mentioned me to people in his world the way people do when they trust someone. None of it was dramatic. None of it arrived with trumpets. It was just a series of small decisions by people who were paying attention, and each one created the conditions for the next. 3 years after that October morning in the driveway with the letter in my hand, I am a senior property coordinator at a company that now manages over 90 properties across 4 counties. I have a savings account that I no longer feel the need to check every morning. I have a new car that doesn't need its transmission looked at. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of Greensboro I genuinely like, and I pay my rent on the 1st of every month, sometimes before. But the thing I come back to, the thing I actually want you to hear, is not the job or the savings account or the apartment. It's this. The moment Beverly sat down at my kitchen table and told me she believed I was someone who'd been knocked sideways rather than someone running from his responsibilities, that was the moment the direction changed. Not because she gave me money, not because she waived the eviction, but because she looked at me and decided I was worth seeing clearly. I don't know who is watching this right now or what your driveway looks like or what's sitting in your mailbox. But if you are somewhere in the middle of a stretch that feels like it's never going to end, I want you to know that the stretch does end. Sometimes it ends because of something large and obvious. Sometimes it ends because a woman in a green quilted vest sits down at your kitchen table with a spiral notebook and tells you she has a problem you might be able to solve. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need it today. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. These stories are about real people navigating real circumstances, and every time you share one, there's a chance it reaches someone sitting in their own driveway holding their own letter, wondering what comes next. Sometimes what comes next is better than anything you thought to plan for.